There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store, or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today.
Welcome to Wired to Hunt's Rut Fresh Radio, bringing you the latest reports from the Whitetail Woods. And now, your host, Spencer Newharth.
This is Wired to Hunt's Rut Fresh Radio, powered by First Light, and I am your host, Spencer Newharth. This is episode 481, and this week we're talking about the Whitetail lockdown. Welcome to Wired to Hunt's Rut Fresh Radio. I am your host, Spencer Newharth, and back again joining us this week is Mark Kenyon. Now, the reason Mark wasn't with us last time is because he was without service somewhere in Nebraska trying to kill a whitetail with his bow. Mark, I'm interested to not only hear how that hunt went, but also what you witnessed for buck activity. So give us a little preview of both.
Yeah, well, it was intense. You know, this is that hunt where I was going out there and trying to learn how to hunt deer in open country with like a handheld decoy, like one of those handheld silhouette heads up decoys. That's what I was using. And that was a brand new thing for me, but it was a ton of fun. I mean, something that I'm absolutely going to want to do more in the future, and a lot of good buck activity. As far as general rut activity and behavior, I saw a lot of cruising. And then I also saw a lot of kind of rut fest where you've got a buck locked on a doe, like a mature buck locked on a doe, and then 3 or 4 satellite bucks, you know, surrounding them, or all 5 of these bucks chasing that doe. I had that happen 2 different days. So, you know, full-blown rut is basically what I experienced last week. And I imagine, you know, there's going to be more and more of that now as more of these bucks are locked on does. So it was definitely a fun week and great to see after an Iowa hunt where I did not see a whole lot of rutting activity. This Nebraska trip was kind of a perfect antidote for that.
So if you had to put a label on the rutting activity that you saw in Nebraska, what would you say that phase of the rut was?
Oh gosh, we were right in that transition, I'd say, between like late chasing to early lockdown. Like there was some of both happening. Pretty darn close, like peak rut. You know, I don't know if we were at peak breeding, but peak rutting activity, and probably, you know, somewhere around now would be what most people would call peak breeding, where the largest number of does are being actively bred.
Yeah, and you brought up lockdown, which is going to be a theme when we interview our guests this week. But I want you to talk a little bit, Mark, about the reality of lockdown and maybe go over like what the perception is that a lot of hunters have about lockdown versus what the reality is of lockdown and what that really means for buck movement.
Yeah. So lockdown is kind of this term that we use now to describe that period of time when the largest number of does are being bred. So if we think of the timing of breeding as being described by a bell curve, right? So for people that don't know what a bell curve is, basically imagine a graph, and there's this line that starts low and it slowly rises to the top like a bell, and then it eventually drops down. That top of the bell would represent when the most does are being bred, which in most parts of the country is happening right around now. So we call that lockdown because when a doe is being bred, usually what happens is a buck, whatever buck has kind of won her, will try to corral her into some little patch of cover or some weird place in the middle of a field or somewhere he can get her away from all the other deer. And he will hang out with her there for a day or 2 or sometimes 3, breeding her and keeping her around. And so people would describe that as being locked down. So that's what's happening. And at this time, there's a whole bunch of bucks that are currently locked down with a doe. That's the general high-level description of what's happening. What most hunters would tell you is that this is a really tough time to hunt because they think all the bucks are locked down, and so there's no way you're going to be able to get a deer on their feet because they're, in one of these little patches. They're stuck with a doe somewhere. They're not moving. And, there is, to a degree, validity in that. Like, that is happening a lot. There are a lot of bucks like that. So it can be a slower time. But it can also be a lights out time because these bucks aren't on does the entire time, right? There's always going to be a buck or two or some that lose their doe or that finish off with a doe or are looking for the next one. And so those in-between moments can lead to chaos. There can be bucks chasing. There can be bucks cruising. There can be all these great things happening right now. It's just going to be a little bit more hit or miss. So I think the trick to this time of year is sticking it out. And even if you have 2 days where it's absolutely dead, trying to keep the faith, because any moment now, that big one could break off of his doe and he'll be right back in the game. And you need to be there too. If you've given up because of 2 slow days, you're going to miss that day window when he is free and he's searching all over the place for that next doe and he's going crazy. There's also a great opportunity if you spot a buck locked on a doe and you can maybe slip in on him. Or lots of times if you see a buck and a doe in a certain little patch of cover, they'll usually stick right around there for the next 24, 36, 48 hours. And you can move right in there and have a kind of consistent movement of that deer. That deer might be in there tight and move around a little bit, or move in the evening for a little bit, move in the afternoon, move in the morning. And if you can get right in there with them, you've got a chance. If you're doing something like I was doing last week with a heads-up decoy, you can move right in on that buck and present the decoy to him head on and kind of challenge him, and he'll come in there and try to push you off. So my cliff notes of this is that while the lockdown can be tough, it also could be, bananas. So don't skip out on it. Be out there because the rut's still happening, and when it happens, it can get really hot and heavy fast.
Yeah, I think you said it best at the end there that like you should still be in the woods this time of year. Still great time to kill a mature buck. And it doesn't happen where it's like a mature buck has a doe corralled for like November 15th and 16th. And then November 17th, he goes right into post rut where he's nocturnal again. He only cares about food sources. It's not like one like phase ends or breeding happens and then it's right to post rut for him. There's still going to be, a lot of movement out there in the woods that hunters can capitalize on. And again, the lockdown thing and breeding is something you're going to hear from the rest of our guests this weekend. And the reading materials for this week, which you can find in the description of this episode, if you're on like Spotify, just scroll down, or iHeart or iTunes, you're going to find these articles linked below. How to E-Scout for the Rut by Tony Peterson. Tony talks about how to use aerial imagery to kill a buck in November, like what he did in episode 1 of 1 Week in November, which is out on YouTube right now. And then we have What I've Learned Watching Deer Have Sex from you, Mark Kenyon. Mark covers how witnessing whitetails breed informed his perspective on hunting in mid-November. And then we have How to Pull Off.
One of my classiest titles ever.
I like it. And then we have How to Pull Off an Almost All-Day Rut Hunt by Tony Hansen. Hansen goes over his strategy for staying in the woods as much as possible this time of year. And then we have What is the Whitetail Lockdown by Mark Kenyon. Mark looks at the reality of the whitetail lockdown and why it shouldn't be a phase of the rut that keeps you out of the woods. Mark, what is next for you? I feel like every time I talk to you, you're in a new state, doing a new hunt. What is next for you on the agenda?
Yeah, man, I leave in a day and a half for Maine, and I'm going to be hunting up in northern Maine, learning how to track deer in the snow with Hal blood. So it's going to be super interesting. My biggest wild card right now is that there's not necessarily snow in the forecast. So if we don't get snow, it's going to be a real doozy. So I'm crossing my fingers and toes that we get the precip that we need, and I can get a good opportunity out there to at least learn this really interesting style of hunting. So that's what I got.
And what about Michigan? Did you forget about Michigan this year?
Yeah, man, this year, because of the crazy slate of travel I have, Michigan's pretty much been put on the back burner. I might get a few hunts in December, but I'm just home for a few days at a time, so I'm mostly just trying to spend it with the family and be a dad when I can. So the Michigan Bucks are kind of getting the free pass this year.
All right, man. Well, they won't get the same treatment next year, I imagine. And I look forward to hearing how the Maine hunt went. Talk to you next week, Mark.
Sounds good. Thanks, man.
All right, and joining us on the line next is Alex Gilstrom, whose writing you can find on Wired to Hunt's website in Illinois. Now, Alex, in Illinois, what would you say the buck activity has been lately on a scale of 1 to 10?
Lately, I'd say in the last week, it's been pretty close to about a 6. Kind of unfortunate, really. We had a really timely cold front. The movement's just been kind of slow overall. We had a timely cold front move in last week and just a few days ago, but it was accompanied by really high winds. So the wind speed was high, anywhere up to around 20 miles an hour. And so pretty sustaining. And it was a south wind, and it had a lot of swirling in it, gusting. And it just seemed to, I don't know if it necessarily subdued the deer movement. The deer just didn't move very well. Didn't see a lot of daylight activity much at all, especially when it comes to rutting activity, not much chasing or seeking. I think we might be in a little bit of a lockdown phase, but it's just, it hadn't been real great so far.
So where do you want to be running your trail cameras this time of year?
I've always had the best success during, the first couple of weeks in November and even phasing into kind of later into the month. I'm a really big fan of just really kind of thick, tight security cover for bedding and security cover for transitions. So thick cover that can be transition zones between doe bedding areas, downwind sides of bedding areas, anything like that. I think that's where I've seen and had the best luck of maximizing, getting not just good pictures of bucks in the area, bucks moving in, or bucks that have kind of like within their home range, but also daylight pictures as well. So you can get kind of a little bit better idea of, or is this based on the buck's rut cruising circuit when they're moving and traveling? Is it more on their morning side or their evening side? You can kind of assess that a little bit better. So I'm a big fan of bedding areas this time of year.
What have you been seeing for sign making as of late?
Not a ton. I haven't seen a lot. Of course, in the first week in November, there was a lot more, but they've kind of seemed to move off of the sign making. Scrapes are getting covered up by leaf drop and leaf fall. There's still some scrapes opening up and some fresh rubs, but it seems like we're in the kind of the stage right now where they're really focused on just finding the does, breeding the does, and getting into that lockdown period, where it really gets aggressive. And they kind of are leaving the scrape checking and things like that away. I'm not seeing a lot of fresh sign pop up recently.
What food sources are relevant right now for deer hunters in Illinois, and what is the crop harvest status in your state?
So the crops are out for the most part here in Western Illinois, West Central Illinois, where I'm at. It's God's country as far as corn, beans, and agriculture. So they don't let the crops stay in the fields much longer than they have to. So by now, we had some late rains and stuff like that maybe held a few things up, but all the bean and corn fields have been harvested by this point for the most part. I mean, except maybe just one or two, just one-offs here and there. But so that's been good. And then now they're really shifting. So we've had a couple of really good hard frosts, some colder weather come in. So really seem to be shifted to the grain. The oak ridges are still pretty hot. I'm seeing still quite a bit of doe activity, feeding and things like that happening on the oak ridges as well. So if you have acorns, it can be pretty timely right now for that as well. But it seems like they're really kind of shifting to the grain pretty good right now.
Historically, do you do any calling or decoying in Illinois in mid-November?
Not really a whole lot in Illinois. I hunt a lot of exclusively public ground in Illinois for the last couple of years. And I'll do some grunting. I don't really rattle a whole lot just because on public it's just so competitive. But I have had some luck with some tending grunts close to bedding or thick security cover, especially if I can see a deer that I want to call to and watch his body language and read it, and just kind of attract and call in to it a little bit more. So I always have a grunt call with me and do some light grunting. But outside of that, I don't do a whole lot of calling myself right at this time.
Going forward then in this next week or so, what do you think that buck activity is going to be on a scale of 1 to 10 in Illinois?
Got to be optimistic. It's got to just bust loose in some of the spots that I hunt now. So I'm thinking it's with the weather looking ahead, the hoping enough, if there was some of the more mature bucks locked down, they're coming off their does, they're looking for that next one, kind of expanding their search a little bit out of their core. So I'm gonna give it an 8. I'm gonna say we're gonna move from that 6 to that 8 and be good to go.
All right, Alex, I like the optimism. Good luck with your hunts. Thanks for joining me.
You bet. Thanks, Spencer.
All right, and joining us on the line next is Wade Middleton from Whitetail Diaries in Texas. Now, Wade, in Texas, what would you say the buck activity has been lately on a scale of 1 to 10?
I think it's about a 6, depending on where you are statewide. In the central part of the state, man, the ruts are actually going on fantastic right now. Everybody I talk to said they're chasing those. I'm seeing deer, bucks chasing those. So you may have to go 8 in that part. But when you get down south, southwest, where we spent a lot of the last 10 days, it's been kind of hot. A lot of late afternoon deer, showing up right at last light. I'll give that about a 6 for that part. But all in all, the hunting has been pretty solid across Texas.
So what phase of the rut would you say sort of northern Texas and southern Texas are in right now?
That central northern part, there's no doubt the rut's going on. From San Antonio north through Austin, going all the way up north from there. Bucks have their nose to the ground. They're doing what we all like, stupid, showing up anywhere at any time. When you go southwest towards Del Rio or you go south of San Antonio, we're still a couple of weeks away from seeing that rutting activity pick up there.
Wade, I know you said earlier this year in February that you had a freeze event that's been one of the most extreme you've witnessed in southern Texas. Is that something that you've seen impact hunting this fall?
Absolutely. That freeze was epic because it reached all the way to the Texas coast, caused big fish kills down there. Axis herds, a lot of them got freezer burn and got frostbite, for lack of a better word, while they were developing. And as such, a lot of the acorn, a lot of the mass crops seem to be stunted. A lot of the acorns that I'm seeing at various places this year are really small, about smaller than the size of your pinky nail. And so therefore it seems like to me the deer have been searching far and wide for, corn feeders. Texas is famous for them, and you're seeing more deer showing up around feeders this year earlier than ever.
So have you noticed that February freeze impact bedding at all, since the deer tend to want to be around the feeders more? Do you notice a shift in bedding in mid-November than what you've seen in the past?
No, the traditional patterns seem to have gotten back to normal. It just seems that, like I said, a lot of the normal mass crops that we have are just a little smaller. The other thing I noticed, we had a mild spring. We had a mild summer. 100-degree temperatures were far less this year than we've ever had. Antler development is phenomenal in a lot of the places that we've been, looking at scouting cameras and hunting in Texas. So it's just been a different year because of the mass crops. A lot of guys that, rely on hunting by a feeder, they're all like, man, we're seeing more deer than we ever have.
In mid-November in southern Texas, does water factor into your setups at all?
It does. We're pretty dry in the southwest part of Texas. We've had good rain in other parts of Texas, but this year they've got that La Nina, as they call it, set up out there in the Gulf, and so we don't get as much rain. We don't get a lot of runoff. We don't have those big storms. And I hunted up in Brownwood area early in October. Obviously, we spent a lot of time around Del Rio. And surface water sources are pretty limited. And if you've got surface water and you go look around the edge of those ponds, you're going to find tracks and you're going to see activity.
I know, Wade, that you like to do some rattling this time of year. Tell us what those setups look like. And when you have a successful one, what maybe those areas have in common when you do get a buck to respond.
For me, rattling, that is one of my biggest passions, but I kind of read the conditions. Am I seeing a lot of scrapes? Am I seeing deer moving? Am I, chasing does in the middle of the day, seeing buck rutting sign? Then I kind of determine how loud and aggressive that I want to be. Right now, if I was in the hill country part of Texas going up north, I would bang those antlers pretty aggressively to try to, lure something in, from sunrise up to about 2:00, I have good success. Down south right now or out southwest, if I'm going to rattle, it's kind of a light tickle. I'm just trying to make enough noise that something that's trolling off in the distance might change direction and come our way. But 2 weeks from now, I'll be banging them pretty hard.
Going forward then in this next week or so, what do you think that buck activity is going to be on a scale of 1 to 10 in Texas?
Texas, it's fixing to blow up everywhere. I would say we've got a cold front coming through, I believe, Thursday of this week. Temperatures are going to get back mild statewide. We've got a little moisture in a few places. I always like that this time of the year. I think it's going to be 8 statewide. I think it's about to break loose.
All right, Wade, good luck to you and everyone else from Whitetail Diaries. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Spencer.
All right, and joining us on the line next is Brian Christner from Knock and Release in Kentucky. Now, Brian, in Kentucky, what would you say the buck activity has been lately on a scale of 1 to 10?
Lately, with our trip, I'd say it was a good 6. We started off our trip on the 9th of November, and we were seeing, just our regular, guys on the property with buck activity and everything, and does. But we're seeing a lot of activity at night. So our daytime activity wasn't the greatest. And then we started rolling into about the 11th and the 12th. We started seeing those young bucks chasing pretty good. Saw a couple nice mature bucks on the 10th actually that morning. And it was, I'd say it was a solid 6, and then near that opening gun weekend, we started rolling into the 7 and 8 range, with the bucks more on their feet, cruising, looking for does. But yeah, it was a good 6 at the beginning of the week, and near this end of this last week, I would say it was a 7 and an 8.
Now you just killed a great buck in Kentucky over the weekend. Tell us about that setup, why you were in that spot, and why that buck wanted to be there.
So that spot was it was on top of a ridge. It was a great spot. It was actually just on a leaner, just a double seated leaner, 15 feet in the air, and it kind of looked down into a natural bottleneck almost, to where those deer traveled that bottleneck pretty hard, and it was about 100 yards from bedding. So we knew the deer traveled through there pretty good. So, and, with all the podcasts we listen to, everyone always says, that first light, if you can grunt and you see, have good light, grunt, try pulling those deer in. If a buck's cruising by, they're going to hear it. And that's exactly how that setup went for me. I took that to heart, and I'm like, I'm going to try this, like everyone says. And I did it. It was right around 6:30. I started grunting, and, within 5 minutes, I had that buck. I saw him about 100 yards out through the woods down that bottleneck, and he literally pinpointed me and walked 6 yards from the bottom of my stand. So it was a well-traveled area. Bedding was nearby, so the does were nearby, and the bucks knew, the does were there, and we kind of had an idea where everything was at too. So it worked out really well for us. But yeah, it was an awesome experience to see that buck so close, and he came straight up to the bottom of my stand, grunting and searching. He knew something was nearby and just made a mistake and came to me.
Where do you want to be running a lot of your trail cameras this time of year in Kentucky?
In Kentucky, where we were at, we were running we had them on food sources, of course, but we sat the woods. We really dedicated ourselves to the woods, near bedding, hardwoods, thick areas. The area I was hunting was pretty thick, with basically off a little cut, about as wide as a small car could go down, and that's where I hunted, in that area. And so where we had all our trail cameras. We were running about 8 trail cameras this last week, and we were checking them religiously. We had a couple cell phone cameras, so that was a huge help, because we knew exactly what was going on nonstop in those areas. So we concentrated very, very heavily on trails in the woods.
What have you been seeing for sign making as of late?
So that was a big, we were pretty disappointed, actually. Come the end of October, we have a nice road cut through there, and plenty of areas where these, overhang trees, little limbs and everything, where you see that sign all the time, rubs and scrapes, and we just weren't seeing that. Well, here this last week, we saw a lot of that happening. We saw bucks making rubs, we saw bucks making scrapes, and hitting those spots, especially after it rained this past Thursday up there in Kentucky. And I think the entire state, the whole Midwest, got that band going through there, and that's what brought that big front in, and which really started that activity. And that's when they were freshening up those scrapes and freshening up those rubs But we saw that a lot this last week.
Going forward then in this next week or so, what do you think that buck activity is going to be on a scale of 1 to 10 in Kentucky?
1 to 10, I think this weekend's going to be a 9. Honestly, I think it's just going to get fired up. It's when we left, you could actually already tell the bucks were on their feet more in daylight, according to our pictures that we were getting, and then and it just, according to other podcasts and other things we listen to and pay attention to, and the hunt cast and everything, it looks like Friday is going to be an awesome day to be in the woods for sure. Friday and this Saturday, it just looks really, really good. So I would be in the woods definitely. If I wasn't tagged out already, I would be up there again. So.
All right, Brian, congrats on that great buck you killed. Thanks for joining me.
Yep, thank you.
All right, and joining us on the line next is Nick Kravitz from Flatline Whitetails in Pennsylvania. Now, Nick, in Pennsylvania, what would you say the buck activity has been lately on a scale of 1 to 10?
I'd say this week it's probably going upwards of 7, 8, maybe 9. I mean, it's getting colder this week is why I would say that. It kind of warmed up there the week before, and now it's dropped back down again, and we actually got some snow recently. So I think that things have been on their feet more, and I mean, I've seen it. All my buddies are really getting the mature deer on the ground right now, so I think it's really ramped things up.
Your brother killed a great buck over this last weekend. Tell us about that setup. Why was he in that area, and why was that buck in that area?
Well, that area in particular actually is a turnip plot, so there's a good food source there off of a thick bedding, and there's a lot of does hanging out in that food, and there's also quite a few bucks in that area. So that buck, I think, came out looking for the does, and they were feeding, and it kind of worked perfectly in that situation.
What would you label this phase as the rut as in Pennsylvania?
Oh man, I would say at this point they're definitely they're beyond lockdown at this point. I don't know, it's hard to say, but they're definitely locked on the does. I actually was hunting with my buddy Billy there, and we watched him breed a doe, and after he bred that doe, he just kind of moved on,
Where are you running a lot of your trail cameras at this time of year?
Well, right now we kind of have them in some different spots. I have a bunch of mine on like the transitions, like pinch points in the thickets there when they're moving from bedding areas to food source, and that seems to be working out good. We have some nice pictures of bucks in these transitions of these bedding areas that we're getting a lot of daylight pictures. Actually, most of the pictures I've been at like 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. is when we're getting a lot of the mature bucks on camera at the moment.
You mentioned that your brother's buck was killed on a turnip plot. What other food sources are relevant right now for deer hunters in Pennsylvania?
Well, when my buddy and I saw that buck breed a doe, actually, all the does and a lot of the little bucks are coming out and they're feeding in that soybean field there where we were hunting. So that's where we were kind of seeing a lot of the activity, a lot of does coming into those soybeans right now. I haven't hunted much of the corn, so I can't speak for that myself, but I know they were definitely hitting the soybeans hard, and obviously the turnip plot there that Tyler was hunting.
What have you seen for sign making as of late?
Well, there's been a lot of weather as far as rain and whatnot, so here and there they're freshening up the scrapes, but it seems like they're more worried about the does at this point. I see a lot, even in my yard when I'm coming home, there's a buck with a doe almost every night in there, so it seems like they're more focused on just going after the does at the moment, but they are still hitting the scrapes periodically as far as I'm seeing. Some of my cameras there are set up on them, but I think it's more hunt the does at the moment as far as that goes.
In mid-November, are you doing any calling or decoying in Pennsylvania?
I personally don't use a decoy myself, but we are seeing some response. We saw some response all this past week here to the grunt calls. They seem to be coming in, getting defensive about it, and it's definitely stirring up some activity as far as we've seen.
Going forward then in this next week or so, what do you think that buck activity is going to be on a scale of 1 to 10 in Pennsylvania?
I think it'll pick up to an 8 or a 9 personally, just because it's cold weather now. It's sticking around, and I think that's really got things really moving. And And I mean, one other thing I would have to say would be where my cousin Jagger had shot his buck was over a water source there. And that buck that he particularly shot, his goal was to come in and drink that water and just move on, but he didn't make it far because Jagger got him before he could leave. So the water seemed to be good there too.
All right, Nick, good luck to you and the boys from Flatline Whitetails. Thanks for joining me.
Yep, take care.
And that concludes this week's episode of Wired to Hunt's Rut Fresh Radio. Thanks to Alex, Wade, Brian, and Nick for joining me, and thank you guys for listening. As a reminder, this week's reading materials can be found in the description of the episode. You're going to see articles like how to e-scout the rut, what I've learned watching deer have sex, how to pull off an almost all-day rut hunt, and what is the whitetail lockdown. And as another reminder, the first episode of 1 Week in November is now available on Meat Eater's YouTube channel, with new episodes dropping every single Tuesday from now until the end of the year. This week's episode, though, the first episode, is especially exciting because Tony Peterson drops the hammer on a giant 4x4 that you're going to want to see. It was an exciting episode to make. I think it's going to be an exciting episode to watch. And I will talk to you next week. But until then, stay wired to hunt.